Sure. Very warm welcome to our respected principal, sir, Dr. Vipin Kumar Agrawal, and to all the participants attending today's session. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you all to our speaker for today. Our speaker was born in Bhilai, Chhattisgarh. He comes from a very humble background, where his brother and he were the first in his family to enter the portals of college. He certainly has come a long way. Currently, he serves as the 17th Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India. He has also served as a member in the Expert Committee for Securities Exchange Board of India and Reserve Bank of India. And most importantly, he has authored 3 economic surveys. He is a professor in Indian School of Business and an alumnus of Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, and Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. The list goes on. On behalf of all the participants, I'd like to welcome Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Sir, it's an honor for us to have you on board. Thank you so much for taking out the time. It will be a pleasure for us to be enlightened by you.
Yeah, and I would also like to add that we are very fortunate to be able to discuss this subject with the man who himself is actively involved in designing and formulating these policies, allowing us a very clear first-hand perspective. We couldn't have asked for more. Thank you for joining, Dr. Subramaniam, and welcome once again.
Thank you so much. I'm really gratified to hear all this. Thank you so much. There's a saying in Hindi, "Khuda meherban tha gadha pehlwan."
So I hope God is always, spreads His goodness towards you, blessings towards you. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a blessing that is invaluable. You know, so I can actually speak, but I think it may be better if we just start. We can have a free round of questions and answers. I think that would, because I'm sure a lot of students will be very curious to ask questions. And in the questions, I can actually cover, all the stuff that students would love to hear. Is that okay?
Yeah, Vidit, tell me, you can ask the students to ask questions. Vidit is our student coordinator for today.
Sure, ma'am. I'll just write it in the chat box so that people can write their question in the chat box so that sir can address them.
Yeah, I think while we wait then for the questions to come, let me just quickly sort of give you maybe a bird's eye view, of keep it very short so that I don't bore you all with, too much details. If you look at the change in economic thinking following the, pandemic certainly, but overall over the last, couple of years, but really starting with the pandemic, think about that economic thinking as basically a tripod that rests on 3 legs. The first leg is a very, very strong focus on growth, GDP growth, together with efficient welfare programs. So that's the first leg of that tripod. That strong focus on GDP growth is extremely important because it is GDP growth that generates the resources to be able to put money for welfare. But not just throwing money into welfare, but doing it efficiently, which is something that this government has done over the last 6 years, whether it's the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, whether it's actually the Ayushman Bharat, or the Awas Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. All of these have actually really helped people on the ground. So the first leg of that tripod is a strong or almost exclusive focus on economic growth together with efficient welfare. That's the first thing. Now, the rest of the other 2 principles are primarily about how to get growth. One of the principles is about what is the objective to follow, and the other principle is how to do it. So the second leg is about encouraging wealth creation and enabling and empowering the private sector. That's the second. Now, this is very important. I especially want youngsters to appreciate this. Given India's socialistic past, the socialistic policies that we followed up till 1991. But even after 1991, words like privatization, etc., were never used in government communication. It was, last year's economic survey for the first time used that, words like wealth creation, privatization, the invisible hand of markets, married with the hand of trust. It was last year's economic survey that basically, to some of the leftists was, possibly, too fresh in terms of the, the way the thoughts that came in. But I want to spend some time, laying the intellectual ground for why, that focus is required. Having myself studied at the University of Chicago, many of us tend to believe that, all economics starts from the, from the Western literature, Adam Smith and their descendants. Yes, literature in English on economics starts certainly from Adam Smith. But what I'm trying to say, let me illustrate that with a couple of important, observations. First, there's this very nice book by Angus Maddison, who did the painstaking work of documenting contribution to world's GDP by various countries from 1 AD till 2000 AD. So for basically 2 millennia. Very painstaking but very, very careful research work. And what does Maddison show? Maddison shows that up until 1750 AD, this is, that 17 and a half centuries, and just, 7 years after imperialism began in India with the, with the 7-day war, and I'm sure all of you have read about that in history. But up until 1750 AD, in other words, 17 and a half centuries, India accounted for more than 33% of world's GDP consistently for 17 and a half centuries. This is a foreigner actually showing this in, using data. Now, to give you a sense of how much of a dominance, economic dominance that is, let me give you some statistics for the United States, which we all acknowledge is the world's economic superpower that, that our generation, maybe, 3 generations knows as US as the dominant economic superpower. What has been the US's contribution to world's GDP at a maximum? It's about 15 to 16% of world's GDP. Okay. So first contrast is, at least 33%, for India, vis-a-vis at a max 16%. Okay. That's the first thing. And how long has the US been an economic superpower? For half a century. Half a century. Now put it together and just imagine actually 17 and a half centuries accounting for at least 33% of world's GDP versus half a century, accounting for maximum 15-16%. So just transport yourself in history. Somebody who, like us, who basically might have been a citizen of the 17th century, 16th century, 15th century, etc. What they would have actually, and that is why all of them used to come to study in India. Why? Because for them, what today we actually think about, the US, for them, India would have been actually, 50 times magnified, economic superpower, actually more than 50, because, the duration of that dominance is 35 times more, half a century versus 17 and a half centuries. And at a minimum 33% versus at a maximum of 33%. So at least double. So at least 70 times more of a dominant superpower. That's what a citizen in the 17th century, 16th century, 15th century would have actually, so I think, but that historical perspective is very important for us to understand. That now you have to understand, such kind of dominance does not come about through accident. It comes because of the quality of the economic model that India pursued. And that economic model, if you go and read our native scriptures, native literature, let me use the word scriptures, because scriptures has a religious overtone, native literature. If you go and read the native literature, and that is, Vidit had mentioned in his introduction, possibly because of the background that I come with, I was not born with a silver spoon. And therefore, I actually have had the open mind to be able to not only go and read the Western literature, but the native literature as well. In my own native language, Tamil, I've had the opportunity to learn Tirukkural, written by Saint Tiruvallur almost 3,500 years back. Similarly, after having learned Sanskrit and gotten interested, I've actually learned Arthashastra, read that as well. Then you find that this kind of dominance happened because of the marriage of the invisible hand of markets with the hand of trust or ethics. And that is what, really led to this dominance. It's not an accident that, all of us in our, those of us who actually, there's a small puja ghar, हम लोग क्या लिखते हैं वहां पे? हम शुभ लाभ लिखते हैं, right? हमेशा शुभ लाभ लिखते हैं. उसमें सोच के देखो, actually think about it. Shubh is basically good, labh is profit, right? And in our daily life, we actually never think about profit as a bad thing. Or for that matter, if you take the four noble pursuits, dharma, arth, kama, moksha, Arth is basically nothing but wealth. Dharma, arth, kama, moksha. Arth is actually regarded as a noble pursuit. That is what our, that is what actually, we have as our heritage, and that's the economic model that we followed. Yes, ephemerally, for 50 years, after all, 50 years is basically just ephemeral in a history of millennia. We ended up, moving away from our DNA. But now basically coming back to that DNA, and therefore respecting wealth creation, respecting private sector, that is what is our DNA. So that's the second tripod. I've actually spent the maximum time, on this, because, this is where a lot of us get brainwashed, thinking that all economics has basically only been taught to us by the West. I have been taught by Western scholars, I've learned, and I'm myself a scholar who's published in the best journals in the West. But then, I don't want to actually portray or to myself just understand an incomplete picture. The complete picture is what I've just presented in front of you. That's the second leg of that tripod. The third leg of that tripod, something that we've tried to explain, in the 2018-19 economic survey and this year's economic survey, is how do we get that growth? Wealth creation, great, and private sector. But what is really important is capex driven growth, investment driven growth. The virtuous cycle. In 2018-19 economic survey, what we did was we looked at every country that over the last half a century has grown at least at 5% plus growth rate, and for at least a decade, 5% plus real growth rate for at least a decade. And what we found is that in each of those countries that had such a sustained high growth rate, growth starts from investment, private investment, which basically increases, productivity, jobs, and that puts, money in the hands of people, which furthers consumption. When consumption increases, anticipating such increase in consumption, firms invest more, and that is how this virtuous cycle proceeds, and you actually have employment growth. So it's actually investment driven growth, what macroeconomists basically call gross fixed capital formation. That's the, the key variable. That's what starts the growth. So that's the third leg, which is capex driven, virtuous cycle starting from investment. That is if you think about, if you try to understand the economic thinking, how it has changed, and, I'm hoping that this is, an economic thinking that will persist for at least 2 centuries going forward. And India will again attain that same, because it has this model has delivered it, in the past, and there's no reason why it actually can't deliver it, because it's well thought, and it's well researched, something that we've actually been there, done it, up until 1750 AD. So that's sort of the change in economic thinking that that has happened on these tripods. So let me summarize. So first is basically exclusive focus on growth with efficient welfare. How do we get that growth? By focusing on enabling wealth creation and the private sector, empowering private sector. And third is basically, virtuous cycle starting from investment, and especially public capital, public capex. And what you see in the budget is actually, budget and the reforms over the last year is essentially illustration or implementation of these big picture ideas. So I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take questions now.
There's a question. US 10-year bonds yields are nearly at 52 weeks high. Your take on how it should cool off, and also we are seeing outflows of funds from FIIs from last few weeks and the distributions at every level. How we will tackle this, and how are we ready to face the consequences of this outflow?
So firstly, see, US Treasury yields, India can do nothing about. Even the US itself has limited ability to do anything about. The reason US Treasury yields have been rising is because now the world economy is starting to grow up, is basically starting to look up. Demand, therefore, world demand is going up, and therefore there is fear of inflation. And because of the fear of inflation, the yields have gone up. So I think that's just simple economics that is at play. So the second part of your question on FII, actually equity inflows are still coming in. It's debt that actually has some of that has gone out. But I think I wouldn't be too worried about it. We basically need to focus on what we have clearly, the clear plan that we've laid out. One of the announcement in last year's economic budget, which is actually the government is in the process of implementing, will help in cooling yields in India, which is including having India's government bonds being included in the sovereign bond indices. What that does is there's about a large amount of passive money, about $3 trillion of passive money that just tracks these global bond indices. In other words, money that just basically is invested in index funds that track these sovereign bond indices. So of that 3 trillion, even if India gets basically about a percentage of that, that's about $30 billion. So 30 billion can easily increase. Supply can increase, and I'm sure you understand supply and demand. So if you have your supply increasing, then what will happen? Actually, obviously, prices will come down, so yields should come down. So that I think is by far the most important step that which the government is working on together with Reserve Bank and the agencies that JP Morgan, Bloomberg, etc., that actually implement these indices. So that three-way communication is going on to actually have this implemented. I think that will be a very important step in cooling off the yields.
So the next question is, what will be the feasibility of bringing petrol and diesels under GST from government? Treasury point of view, if it will reduce tax rate and ultimately lower the pie of government taxes?
Good question. The economics of it actually demands that it should be part of GST. The politics of it is actually is a different kettle of fish. And to just add, I always restrict myself. I've created a Lakshman Rekha for myself. That's my own self-imposed Lakshman Rekha, which is I stay within economics. I don't get into the politics.
Yes, sir. So how is India truly performing after COVID era? Are we achieving the V curve?
Why this word truly? Do you guys not believe what we whatever we've put out in the economic survey is based on data, and carefully analyzed data. I'm not into building narratives. I just lay out what I'm a plain speaker. Just put out data. Don't believe in building narratives, etc. Believe in in just putting out the truth. So take a look at the economic survey first chapter. You yourself get convinced. Look at the GDP growth rates. By the way, any narrative that these GDP growth rates are all actually are quote unquote managed is actually not quite right. And by the way, I would recommend you, all of you, last week I wrote an article in the Times of India, an op-ed in the Times of India, let me see if I can pull that out and put it on the chat box for you guys to take a look. I think the youngsters should certainly, so let me just quickly look for it. Yeah, so that's the article that I would request all of you, especially youngsters, to read. Examples from cricket, examples from COVID, etc. So I think it will be an interesting read for all of you to go through as well. This is just in the context of, because you preambled by putting the word truly, I'm just laying out the data the way it is. I don't have to defend myself as, I'm being truthful or I'm lying, I just don't think that's required.
Yes, absolutely.
So the next, yes, ma'am.
Vidit, you continue. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So, sir, the next question is, since many organizations and statistics show that India is the only country in the world that has double-digit growth, will the estimated growth be close to the double digit, especially when we are seeing another wave of COVID-19?
Will the estimated or will the actual growth is a question, I'm sure. So what people have projected is estimated growth. I think the question is, will the actual growth be, as much as estimated? I think that's what the question, I presume, is. Yes, I think that, and let me say that all of us should continue to follow the precautions, because we're still not out of the pandemic fully. But the vaccination is proceeding, unlike the previous wave, right? When basically, there was no vaccine, and now vaccine is there. So yes, vaccine, I would ideally want the progress of the vaccination drive to be much faster than what it is. That's my private observation. I'm sure, there are constraints that the Ministry of Health and others must be facing, but my own, my own sense is that we should be proceeding at much faster rates. But that said, still the fact that there is vaccination means that it's unlikely the pandemic will spread much more. And lessons have been learned from the previous, while we managed the pandemic very well, but even from that, there have been important lessons learned, which is, test, and quarantine. I think that's what Maharashtra, actually, you might have seen, the health secretary has written a letter, to the chief secretary of Maharashtra, precisely saying this as well. So, those lessons can be implemented as well. In other words, if you look at last year, this period, you think about learning curve for anything, right? We were at the basically a bottom of that learning curve. Now we've learned a lot more and things to implement. So I actually am, while we should be still, following the necessary precautions, I don't think that the effect will be as bad as, as it was. We certainly don't have to go for a national level lockdown, etc. That won't happen, because these are localized. So I don't think that the impact will actually be so widespread, this time around.
So the next question is, ex-RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan calls the privatization of the public sector banks a colossal mistake. There are related concerns in all the sections of the economy. Your views on the same?
Firstly, I think you should read what Raghu has said very carefully. A lot of media are actually taking what he has said out of context. What he has said is, if these banks are sold to some corporates, then it will be a colossal mistake, is what he has said. I think that's the first thing. So that's why, again, be very careful what you read, because those just that little bit of what has been said, when you just pick up the colossal mistake without, colossal mistake if that if part is missed out, then there is a completely different picture that is portrayed compared to what is, and that's why I would urge you to read that article that I just posted, on in the post-truth world that we live in of social media. Much like products and services are sold by companies for their private profits, ideas are also sold similarly for private interests, and which all of us must be very careful about. So I have a lot of respect for Raghu. I mean, he's my advisor, not only my advisor, my mentor as well. I think what he said needs to be seen in the total context.
Yes. Sir, as you mentioned about the introduction of the concept of GDP in India, in US, their main focus is on employment generation. But in India, we see a huge growth with huge.
No, I think the question, US has not introduced GDP concept recently. I think the question is not very clear. GDP has been there now for at least a century.
Yes, so it says that, but in India, we see a huge growth in the huge unemployment. So what is the solution do you see about this?
Read the question again. Actually, I'm not clear about the question.
So, sir, as you mentioned about the introduction of the GDP concept of GDP in US, their main focus is on employment generation.
I've never mentioned about the introduction of the concept of GDP in the US. It's been there since at least the Great Depression. So, okay, let me take at least the second part of the question. Employment. See, in any economy, employment is does correlate with the economy itself. For instance, during this pandemic, United States, Europe, all these countries, employment has been significantly impacted. In India also, it was impacted, but it's coming back now. The government has introduced a specific program in the month of October to encourage jobs that were lost to be brought back as well, incentivizing by giving the employers a wage subsidy on the especially on the provident fund to incentivize employment. So the government has taken steps, but as I was saying early on, when we get basically growth, and coming year growth should be high, then that should lead to employment creation as well.
Yes, sir. So do you think that sovereign credit of India, as highlighted in economic survey, will affect borrowing?
No. That's precisely what you said in that chapter.
So what do you think about investments done by Tesla and Apple? What benefits, incentives are they getting from the government? Will Tesla be successful in India as we have seen the fall of Chevrolet?
No, Tesla is actually Tesla is a very innovative model. I think the comparison to Chevrolet is not appropriate. Chevrolet, General Motors in general. I mean, if you look at even in the US, a lot of the innovative technologies in automobile sector are brought by the Japanese companies, and of course now Tesla, for instance. So I think comparing Chevrolet and Tesla is an apples to oranges comparison. Tesla coming in, especially innovation generates a lot of spillover benefits, for both downstream and upstream sectors. So I think it's a very, very welcome thing that Tesla is setting up shop in India, because, that will really create a full industry of, for the electric, vehicles industry, and something that, India, definitely needs. So similarly, Apple setting up shop as well, and assembling their phones here is a good thing. In the last year's economic survey, in I think it was chapter 5, we've actually had written about how India should focus on labor-intensive exports, and assembling is also something that India should do, and thereby which can provide a lot of jobs in the organized sector. in a labor-intensive economy like ours, that actually is a very, important opportunity. So, Apple, therefore, actually, that's also a very welcome, move. In general, actually, if you see, and I'll give you this example, so that you can, to fix ideas. When Suzuki came to India, initially Maruti was only assembling cars, so all the components used to come from Suzuki, everything, right from the chassis to everything, and it used to be assembled here, in India. That happened for a few years, and then the entire value chain developed. So you had the ancillary sectors, downstream, upstream, everything, and today the automobile sector is such a well developed one. That's how industries develop. Similarly, I'll give you one more example of from the automobile sector. There was a time when I was your age, Hero Honda used to be the bike, along with Yamaha, and Hero Honda. Today you actually have separate. Hero makes separate bikes, Honda makes separate bikes, because that joint venture, of Hero Honda got dismantled about, I think, 8 to 10 years back, if I remember right. And why did that happen? The joint venture was created because Honda wanted the distribution network that Hero technology and Honda got the distribution, developed the distribution network. They've gone their separate way. Why am I using this example? Because in this is a case where Hero Cycles was able to understand and get the technology, and that's how innovative activity happens. And so Tesla and Apple setting up shop along the same lines is excellent. Should be encouraged.
So what's your take on cryptocurrency?
What's my take on cryptocurrency? It's a very, very broad question. I think that's a question that actually should, it should be a 35-40 minute conversation on it. I don't think, it's a question where I can sort of give you it's a very nuanced question. So I would rather not comment, on it without being able to get into sufficient detail.
Yes, sir. So what can be the impact on employment due to privatization on banks?
Positive. If you look at the, across the board, last year's economic survey, we showed how privatization, and wealth creation has created so many jobs. And, let me say this anecdotally. See, when in the mid 80s, mid 80s, late 80s, I was in school, quite young. I used to see, people whom we were kids, right? So there were people who had finished, their masters, MSc, MA, MCom, etc., sitting at home. We used to call them bhaiyas. Okay. They used to come and play cricket with us because MSc कर लिया, MA कर लिया, MCom कर लिया, नौकरी नहीं मिल रहा है तो चलो बच्चों के साथ cricket खेलते हैं, ठीक है? So this was then before liberalization. Now, what is the situation after liberalization? Actually, many of my cousins who haven't even finished class 12, some of them, they get jobs actually even just finished class 10. So look at the difference. People with MA, MCom, MSc, etc., would not get jobs earlier, because the economy basically was a closed one. There wasn't, private sector was not allowed that much. What did liberalization do? It basically enabled the private sector. Look at the, so when you buy from Swiggy, when you buy from Zomato, or you actually order from, from let's say Big Basket, any of those. Look at the jobs that, each of those people who come and ply that, right? When Domino's comes and delivers that pizza, that person who's delivering that pizza, without Domino's, that job wouldn't have been there, right? Without Swiggy, the person who comes to deliver, that person wouldn't have gotten jobs. Without Ola, the person who's actually driving the Ola cab would not have had. So you look all around you, you will actually see how, private sector activity creates so much jobs. So, this narrative that is being furthered by people who have actually just enjoyed very cushioned jobs, सुबह सुबह 9 बजे 10:30 बजे जाओ, 5 बजे वापस आओ. Actually, public banks में उतना कुछ, ज़्यादा भागदौड़ नहीं. That in public sector banks, please don't actually buy that narrative. Look at what the facts are. Look around yourself. कितने jobs create हुए हैं. Private sector banks themselves have created so many jobs as well. As I mentioned as earlier also, jobs are related to economic activity. It's, this is actually a notion that has developed in India because of our socialistic past, that sarkar mein hi job milte hain. Sarkar mein, look at the number of, for a position, peon position ke liye 20 lakh application aate hain. क्यों? क्योंकि और 20 लाख एप्लीकेशन कितने 100 प्यून रिक्रूट करने होंगे. So that tells you actually सरकार में जॉब्स नहीं है, not just in India, anywhere in the world. So it's private sector activity, economic activity, that is what creates jobs. Look around yourself, and then you'll start seeing actually how how much of a fake narrative this is. That and as the Honorable Finance Minister has said very clearly yesterday, she said it earlier on earlier occasions as well, that while the privatization happens, actually those that are employed there, they will also be taken care of. Actually, that's what she clearly, privatization is better, because these banks will grow. When they grow, they'll hire more people and more jobs will be created. Abhi kya ho raha? Actually, these banks are shrinking, and as a result, basically, there is no hiring that is happening. So new job creation will happen, only when economic activity expands.
Yes, sir. So the next question is,
just a second, Dr. Subramanian, do you think we can take some more of your time? Actually, we were given the time slot of 3 to 3:30, but your schedule must be packed, so you have to decide whether you can spare some more time.
Maybe just a couple of, I didn't want to interrupt while a lot of questions were coming in. That's why maybe a couple of questions we can take.
All right. Okay, we will then continue.
Thank you so much, sir. So will India become the next China as the production capital of the world?
Okay, let me, in private, I don't want India to become another China, because think about it. I'll give you a personal anecdote example. When I was doing my PhD at at the University of Chicago, there was this colleague of mine who actually was from China. So she had, back in China, she had but like in India, they also are a patriarchal society, so they want boys. The sister could have another kid, but sort of jugaad, like here as well, was able to say kisi aur ka hai, like that, but was able to have another boy. Her brother, because the brother used to work with the Chinese government, had a kid who was a daughter, and then could not basically have another kid because they had had another kid. That's what, similarly, you can't go and speak freely there. There are so many columnists and reporters who actually all the time basically just keep criticizing the government, for instance, right? But they have the right to do that only because India is a vibrant democracy. Just imagine, this won't happen in China or cannot happen in China. So while we want to actually implement some of those some of the policies, but any day, a democracy is actually, is far better. कई बार actually जो हमारे पास होता है उसको हम उतना value नहीं देते हैं. Actually, there's a saying in Hindi, जब तक आप धूप में नहीं जाओ तब तक आपको छांव की मतलब नहीं पता चलती. So that's something. So let's value what we have. Really, and bhul ke bhi, don't desire that we should basically, we want growth, and growth will happen actually. In a democracy also, there are periods where we've actually had very high growth as a democracy, and we will. So we don't want to be losing all the benefits of a democracy, but we will have that. I'm sure the person who's asked this question may be thinking, मैंने तो सिर्फ manufacturing के बारे में पूछा था, ये तो actually बहुत बड़ा जवाब दे रहे हैं. So, but I thought it's important to, put that in perspective. On the manufacturing, yes, I think there is an opportunity. But, you must remember that, that there are, much like in economics, there's always trade-off. There are benefits of a democracy, there are some costs as well. So, we will try. Actually, I think there is an opportunity, and the government has really pushed reforms to enable manufacturing, whether it's labor reforms, the PLI scheme, the change in MSME definitional changes, all the policies are to strengthen the manufacturing sector, and manufacturing sector is responding very well as well. If you look at the if you look at the purchasing managers index, actually is hit in manufacturing is really doing very well. So I think India will definitely grow in manufacturing, but I don't like that particular parallel that you specifically gave.
According to you, which state is doing really well in terms of their economic condition?
This year or long run?
In long run, sir.
The southern states are doing well. Gujarat is doing well. Uttar Pradesh is doing well in terms of growth. I think these are some of the states that I think are growing really well.
So big public sector bank employees are going on strike due to proposed privatization.
I think
how we will manage?
I've answered the question already. I think, as I said, there is, privatization creates benefits. Let me give you a parallel. I don't know how many of you have ever had the opportunity to कभी रेलवे के थर्ड क्लास कंपार्टमेंट में कभी ट्रैवल किए हो? किसी ने ट्रैवल किया है यहाँ पे? Actually, if you were in a classroom, I would have asked for a शो ऑफ हैंड्स. हमने चलती है दिल्ली में जो भी बैठ गया वो एक्चुअली बाकी किसी को आपको अंदर आने नहीं देता. दिल्ली में जो बैठ गया वो एक्चुअली वो पहुंचेगा, कालका पहुंचेगा, जहां भी उसका गंतव्य है वहां तक पहुंचेगा. लेकिन मान लो किसी को कानपुर में चढ़ना है या फिर उससे पहले कहीं और इसमें आगरा में चढ़ना है तो कोई नहीं चढ़ सकता. यही सिचुएशन है आपका विद बेसिकली विद यूनियंस. उनको तो अच्छी नौकरी मिली हुई है, ठीक है, सारे बेनिफिट्स हैं उनको, वो गाड़ी में बैठ गए हैं, लेकिन बाकी और लोगों को भी वो गाड़ी चाहिए, जॉब की गाड़ी चाहिए उनको भी. they also want to enjoy the all the good things that come with a formal sector job. But much like जो पहले बैठ जाता है थर्ड क्लास कंपार्टमेंट में, किसी और को घुसने नहीं देता, वही सिलसिला वही है. एक्चुअली आई थिंक मैं जो कह रहा हूँ तो समझदार को तो इशारा काफी होता है, समझ जाओगे.
So we have a last question. It says that estimated fiscal deficit is 9.5%, but being conservative, don't you feel for government that they have hardly upside left in future in this segment if we fail to increase growth rate?
Read chapter 2 of the economic survey. और सारे जवाब इस क्वेश्चन के उस चैप्टर में है. This year's economic survey chapter.
Thank you so much, Dr. Subramanian. I speak on behalf of everyone present here today when I say that this has been indeed a very informative and interactive. You've answered the questions so patiently, given us extra time out of your busy schedule, and engaged in a very engaging session, just as we had hoped it would be. It was an absolute pleasure having you here, Dr. Subramanian. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to get another opportunity to interact with you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
With it, you can probably circulate the feedback form now.
Sure, ma'am. Varun, if you have the form, put it in the chat.
Ma'am, we can give 5 or 10 minutes to the participants to fill up the feedback form, and then I will end the meeting.
All right.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Shastra. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.